A pleasure to meet all at last, and welcome back once again to Video Games That Are Totally Awesome. So, I've had a good chance to talk about the first three Transformers games that correlated to the Bayverse films, but here's a good example of a Bayverse film basically rewritten into a game, re-customized, as well as redesigned between another existing franchise, alongside the current one. Transformers Rise of the Darkspark, which came out in 2014, and was in fact one of the first PS4 games that I got. After all, I got that game on my 15th birthday, and let's just say, after playing through it a few times at least, my most recent playthrough took place in 2022, which was mostly meant for GWK 18-. But in the faces of many people who might be familiar with this game, let me tell you something. It's one thing to make a game based on a Bayverse film. It's one thing to make a game that is supposedly going to connect to the Cybertron games, which have been around since 2010. And it was certainly one thing for one of the Bayverse-based games to be pretty much inspired based on playability and gameplay style by that of the Cybertron series. After all, Dark of the Moon's playstyle was a third-person shooter, and it acted very much like the War for Cybertron gameplay that we've remembered. It wasn't anything like the other two games, which they had their own playstyle to it and control function. No, Dark of the Moon behaved very much like the Cybertron games, but because of the fact that it worked so well between this as well as both Cybertron games that were out at the time, Rise of the Darkspark actually intended to give us a look into the Cybertron universe once again, as well as take us to the point in the Bayverse upon which the events of Age of Extinction took place. After all, Age of Extinction was such a big deal, even more so than the other three films. So much so that all this advertising and all this other stuff that they put together allowed Michael Bay to go at it with over $1 billion in the box office, practically making Age of Extinction one of the biggest films of 2014, and also one of the highest grossing films of the 2010s. But as we know, it's been heavily shadowed by tons of 2019 successes, just to name a good example. But this is going to be quite a big ordeal worth talking about here, because we know about the story of Age of Extinction, right? It's centered on Optimus Prime, as well as most of the Autobots, in hiding, supposedly because there was some sort of attack being made against them in secret by humanity. And as we know, that turned out to be true. They weren't alone, though. They had their own Transformer alongside them, the bounty hunter known as Lockdown. He has had a fair amount of representation up until that point in 2014, especially appearing in the animated series, Transformers Animated, back in 2008. Though he's also had a few appearances in other media, including the Transformers Spark Chronicles in 2010, as well as in the IDW Comics series from time to time. But in 2014 was when Lockdown was truly heralded as a big character in the Transformers franchise. And it's safe to say, that might not be changing anytime. I do hope that he sticks around, though. No matter what he is, he's definitely an outsider of the Transformers universe. He doesn't wear either insignia, Autobot or Decepticon. He just works his own sort of thing, flying solo, and the fact that he has the power to take on so many others without any assistance goes to show he really is quite a character to deal with. And with his unique voice by Mark Ryan in Age of Extinction, how does that fare in the game? Well, first off, he's not voiced by Mark Ryan. He's voiced by Grimlock. Yeah, Greg Berger. The same guy who's done Grimlock for all these years, even as far back as G1. Though he also did the voice for Skyfire, later renamed to Jetfire, upon whom the role is now done to Troy Baker. So, Greg Berger did the voices for both these characters, but now he's doing Lockdown. So, is that supposed to be a good thing? A bad thing? I can't even tell at this point. But I guess one thing seems to be left out here. Well, I guess we'll talk a bit about the plot of Age of Extinction. First off, we get to play as Drift. His unique Bugatti Veyron form is represented in the game quite well, and I will say that the combat system as well as navigation work very much like how we've seen in the Cybertron games alongside Dark of the Moon. Even familiar sound effects can be heard just as well, really making you feel immersed in the world of Cybertron, despite the fact this is another Bayverse title just as well. Oh, but hold that thought, because get this, even after the first mission is done, we basically have ourselves a bit of a mystery to solve. There's apparently a thing known as the Dark Spark, and its power was stolen by Lockdown. It was unlike anything the Transformers race has ever seen, but Optimus Prime was in fact one of only a good handful that have had close encounters with the Dark Spark itself. And this is where we're brought on into, believe it or not, the Cybertron side of the story. Yeah, so if War for Cybertron and Fall of Cybertron wasn't enough, here comes Rise of the Dark Spark. Like I said, this is basically a cross between the Cybertron series and the Bayverse series both coming together. And it's technically true that the Cybertron series were more or less the predecessor series to what we got nowadays. Cybertron practically existed in the timeline before G1, and while this is technically considered to be canon by the means of it acting like a prequel series occurring before the events of G1 took place, the Great War of 1984 occurred. And the thing is that there's been a lot of stuff that's happened since then, but it was more than okay to have these games represented in the official timeline, because they, after all, highlighted the many events that transpired. And while there were tons of other Transformers media over the years, especially with the more recent Transformers 1, giving us a supposed origin as to how Optimus and Megatron were born. You know, it sure was quite a ride. But hey, I've already talked a lot about that film last year. Anyways, though, we actually switch back and forth between the Cybertron and the Bayverse series. No kidding. Every single level we get in this whole game, we go from Bayverse to Cybertron, Bayverse to Cybertron, Bayverse to Cybertron, Bayverse to Cybertron, until it just mostly sticks to the Bayverse side of all things, because after all, with all the stuff that we've done here, the Cybertron parts of the story, where the Dark Spark is eventually sent off of planet Cybertron, hoping to never end up in the wrong hands, is basically just what it is, you know? But just like with the other two Cybertron games, we do get a good representation of Cybertron-related gameplay in this just as well. But let's be sure about this real quick, because I want to address a couple things here. First of all, remember the fact that War for Cybertron and Fall of Cybertron happened to take place before the events of Transformers as a whole? Well, guess what? The idea of there being an object known as the Dark Spark, an artifact that could give its user some insane power, this practically contradicts a number of things in the timeline. And it also seems a bit condescending to try and introduce something in the timeline that is only made to be a more recent phenomenon. I mean, it's true that the Dark Spark had to have come from somewhere, but the thing is, with all the events that they put together in both those games, it felt like that they just shoehorned the Dark Spark into it. There was never a single mention of it. After all, the Dark Spark supposedly takes place sometime before the events of Fall of Cybertron, and on top of all that, why would they even want to put Cybertron into a game that's supposedly made for an advertisement of Age of Extinction? I guess just to make a few extra bucks. And this ain't the only Transformers game that we got. There was a couple games on mobile. There was a couple games that had been possibly put together, but in a somewhat butchered way. There were some attempts to get some of the older Transformers games put on more modern consoles at the time, in the same way as how other companies have been trying to pitch in and put in their own unique ideas. But let's be real though. We go from Drift to going to a few Decepticons, looking around for the Allspark and the Darkspark itself. The power of the spark that is inside of Optimus Prime's matrix of leadership is supposedly enough to counteract the likes of the Darkspark itself. And with all of the Cybertron missions that we've gone through here, with Bruticus capturing Jazz, with the liberation of it taking place, and the Darkspark being sent off to the stars, we cut back to the Bayverse series, this time for good. No more Cybertron stuff to get in the way. But from then on out, we basically do have the opportunity to play as Bumblebee, where he reunites with Drift after he gets captured, and we're able to bring in Grimlock. Oh man, I would say compared to how he was represented in the Cybertron games, they were able to really do him justice here. I mean, in both cases, we have his unique transformation sequence taking place. More of an animated cutscene than just a simple control function and then pff, that's all you need to know. But to be fair, I mean, Grimlock in both cases was such an insane powerhouse. Think about his representation in Age of Extinction. He was practically willing to kill Optimus just to be free. I mean, Optimus practically made Grimlock his own pet. It does sort of undermine that sort of power that Grimlock is known to have, but think back to when G1 occurred. How was Grimlock even made in the first place? He was made mostly because of Wheeljack's intuition and intelligence. But there, of course, were the simple brains. That was sort of the main drawback to the Dinobots in general, not just with Grimlock. And on top of all that, they actually ended up going out of control for some time. As said before though, Lockdown had absorbed the power of the Darkspark into his system, practically making him unstoppable. And the fact is that with many enemies he sent out, it almost seems kind of pointless to really send out a whole army's worth, especially when he has the power of 1,000 Transformers in his own body. That's kind of what the whole purpose of the Darkspark was, right? Is that it bestowed its own user with unbelievable energy, enough to crush anybody with their bare hands. So, I just don't get it, at this point. It's almost like they are trying to make it a bit more on the overly complicated side of things. But in the end of it all, when Grimlock, Optimus, Bumblebee, and the others do make their way over to Lockdown's new hideout, he's basically attempting to use the power of the Darkspark for something more than just his own enhancements. But of course, we know that Lockdown, much like how things played out in the movie, he's not willing to go down without a fight. So, the final boss is in fact Lockdown himself, and Optimus Prime. Just as what we remembered from the movie, but in a much different way. Yeah. Even after all that, he actually manages to get out of there. He doesn't die like in the movie. No, man. Just because it's a game that's supposedly meant for kids. Where have I seen that before? Huh. RoboCop did it? Yes. That was long ago, though. Compared to today, well, maybe not today, but still, more than 10 years ago. At the end of the day, Rise of the Darkspark had certainly flopped for what it is. I am more than willing to let go of a lot of the more horrid aspects of it, a lot of the unnecessary cuts, and the shoehorning of a certain artifact from the past. There was never a mention of it to begin with. There was not even any codex or index mentionings of something called the Darkspark in the older games. There's just a lot of information here that really does feel like it either retcons or completely washes the timeline with some fresh new stuff. Stuff that unfortunately does not feel necessary. We know that Age of Extinction had more than just a straight up purpose in the timeline. When it comes to the Bayverse films, Age of Extinction was a big turning point for the Autobots, Decepticons, at least what's left of them, and humanity. It was a time where the Autobots learned humanity could no longer be trusted. Humanity was using the Transformers as technology to create their own brethren. And the Decepticons were practically just servants to them. Galvatron, Stinger. While Lockdown was basically the true villain in all of this. He wasn't just any bounty hunter. He had a lot to live up to. And so did everybody else. He was a villain unlike any other at the time. In this game, though, while he still does present a pretty foreboding and intimidating aura, just as we recognize, he doesn't really possess that same sort of unique feeling like what we had gotten in the movie. Also, to have all the Cybertron segments, it's still quite fun to have the Cybertron bits, considering the fact that Cybertron is still seen as a continuity with a lot of recognition. It's no wonder why years later they decided to make a show about it. Yeah, War on Cybertron, a Netflix series. Y'all can go check that out. But the way I see it, Rise of the Darkspark, I guess I was more than glad that eventually, after many years of owning that copy of that game, since I turned 15, I'm more than glad that I eventually auctioned it off. I got $93 off of it. Especially when you take into the fact that I put my own signature inside the box. Yeah. So with that in mind, we're just going to go ahead and leave this game now with a 6.0 out of 10.1. Not exactly a great piece in mind, considering all the flaws that it has. But the action in this game does seem to make up for it to some degree, but not by a whole lot. So, there are other Transformers games that I will be talking about here, but tune in next time, as well as the time after that, and Earthspark Expeditions and Galactic Trials will be on the list.